same way. I'm Marian Deutschman. I'm a member of the boards of both the American Association of University Women and our co-sponsor, the League of Women Voters of Buffalo Niagara. Well, there are at least 8 states that have passed laws against critical race theory, and around 20 more have bills pending. And if those statistics are not quite correct, I'm sure our experts here will correct me. What is critical race theory? Where is it taught? These laws may result in thousands of schools facing fines or the threat of losing funding. Teachers could be suspended as lawmakers across the United States move to limit teaching about race and about racism in our American society. Unfortunately, critical race theory has become whatever media sources you rely on say it is. Is it a historical movement to solve a problem that may not exist? Is it part of a conspiracy to convince voters that the left has taken over the school and the workplace? Any law that bans specific books, pieces of journalism, or words from classroom discussion needs clarification and understanding. So we have a set of experts tonight, led by Dr. Peter Iacobucci, who will be our keynote speaker and our moderator. I call your attention to the program with background information on each of the speakers. Thanks to Betty Prevost, past president of AAUW, for producing the program. And I'll give you, I will introduce Dr. Iacobucci, and it will probably be part of what you see on your program. And then he will introduce our other panelists. Dr. Peter Iacobucci is an associate professor of political science and public administration at SUNY Buffalo. Are you calling it SUNY Buffalo State still? You are, okay. It's hard to know when some of the names change. Dr. Iacobucci's research includes constitutional law, administrative law, discrimination law, and American government. His publication focus is on decision-making of the United States Supreme Court and on the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. He did graduate work at Georgetown University, University of Arizona, and law training at the University of Akron Law School. Prior to becoming an academic, Dr. Iacobucci worked for the U.S. Department of Justice as a federal law enforcement officer, criminal investigator, and policy analyst. So, now that you have a bit of background on Dr. Iacobucci, you have the information on your program, it's time for me to hand the explanations of critical race theory over to our experts. How racist are we? Dr. Iacobucci.
Thank you very much, Marian, and thank you very much for the invite. And for those of you that have seen me present before, thank you very much for inviting me back. And that's not good. Maybe I'll just hold it. I'm very glad to be here. And as I told Marian before, I'm not just glad to be here to talk about this topic and to talk to all of you, but I'm glad to be at LWVBN. As some of you may know, my grandfather, my mom's husband's father, was best friends with LWVBN's father when they grew up together in Italy. And they came over here together when they immigrated right around World War I And then, of course, Mr. DePaulo's son became the famous Ilio DePaulo. And, of course, my grandfather's son became my dad, which is more important.
Yeah.
So, anytime I can get back to Ilio DePaulo's, it has been a while since I've been here. There used to be a picture here of myself and my twin sister when we were little babies in the hands of Ilio DePaulo's massive, catcher's mitt's hands. It used to be on one of the walls. I don't think it exists anymore, but I used to love that picture. So I used to come here a lot as a child. So today, I'm just going to spend a little time to talk to you a little bit about critical race theory. And I'm going to talk to you in just a couple segments. I'm going to talk first about where does it come from? Where did this idea of critical race theory come from? It's a few decades old. It began within law schools generally, and then became a solid, sophisticated, well-developed set of theories around race and law within the United States. Okay. Then we'll talk a little bit about what are the basic tenets of critical race theory. It's not universally accepted, all tenets on everything. No theory is like that. But these are I'll give you 5, okay, of the basic tenets. And then I'll talk a little bit about how it's now being used as this political weapon against other groups within America, and how that really is an echo of what we've seen over and over again. So one thing I have to ask someone to do, my PowerPoint is over there on the computer. Marion, would you do me a favor and just go over there and click the button and we'll move to the next slide. I have just a few slides, and what I might do for this table over here, let me see if I can move this back a little bit so I'm not blocking you. Okay, there we go. Okay. While we're getting ready to go into this, let me just say I am so happy to be here with my 2 fellow panelists. Okay, Crystal Rodriguez Dabney and her husband Philip Dabney are leaders within our community within Buffalo, and they so graciously accepted our invitation to come and join me. I did say to Marion when she first brought this topic up to me several months ago, I go, Marion, you know I'm a white middle-aged male, right? This is a little uncomfortable. But I also think when I thought about that more and more, there's nothing wrong with it. It's an academic topic, right? Everybody should be able to talk about the academic topic. So I invited our panelists here to give a different perspective, and a perspective that's closer to their own upbringing and their own, experience than I would have. So once I do my introductory remarks, I'll bring the panelists forward, I'll introduce them a little more in detail, and then what I would love to have is just an open discussion, and I'll moderate. Anybody that has questions, raise your hand, yell out a question. If you need the microphone, I'll share the microphone with you. So that's what we're going to do. So let me talk a little bit about the sources of critical race theory. Okay. This gentleman here is Derek Bell. Derek Bell was a civil rights attorney back in the late 1950s, early 1960s. He was an Air Force veteran, and then after serving for 2 years, he returned and went to law school at Pittsburgh Law School. And he was the only African American to graduate in his class. And then he was almost immediately hired by the U.S. Department of Justice, brand new civil rights division in the very, very early 1960s. However, he was also a member of the NAACP. And his employers at the U.S. Department of Justice said to him, look, you can either work for us or you can be a member of the NAACP. And he said, well, I'm going to be a member of the NAACP. So he quit. However, before he quit, he was recognized by a famous attorney, you might have heard of him, Thurgood Marshall, recognized his quality and brought him into the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. Those are the people that fought Brown versus Board of Education. And then hundreds of desegregation lawsuits within the South to desegregate all public institutions within the South, following the principles coming out of Brown versus the Board of Education, which we celebrate today. How did Mr. Bell get to critical race theory? Well, Mr. Bell, in all of these cases that he was helping with, came into a case out of Harmony, Mississippi. Now, if you've never heard of Harmony, Mississippi, it's not a surprise. It's a tiny little town in backwaters, Mississippi. Harmony, Mississippi had a large African American community that were former freed slaves, or the descendants of former freed slaves. And during the 19-teens and the 1920s, these little independent little school districts across the South, and especially in Mississippi, had built schools for the children of African Americans within these communities. Okay? They were fully segregated. These were schools for black children, but they were funded by the CEO and largely the creator of Sears Roebuck. Not the original Sears and Roebuck, but the one that really pushed Sears and Roebuck to be the company it became in the 20th century. That individual was a good friend with Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington convinced him that if you want to see African Americans rise within America, the best thing you can do is get them educated. So to his credit, that individual sponsored over 5,000 schools within the South for African Americans, and dotted throughout the southern part of the United States are these small little schools for African Americans in little towns and little villages to educate these students. Harmony, Mississippi had one of these schools. But in the late 1950s, the all-white school board of Harmony, Mississippi voted to close the school. One of the parents, Winsome Hudson, reached out to Mr. Bell, working for the NAACP, and said, "Help us keep our school open." Mr. Bell told Winsome, "Well, I can keep your school open, but that's not what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting to desegregate schools in America." And Winsome Hudson said, "That's not what we want. We don't want to desegregate the schools." And for Mr. Bell, trained by Thurgood Marshall, trained within the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, he said, "Why would you say that?" And she said, "You don't understand. Okay? You don't live here down in the South. Okay? You're from up north. You grew up in Pittsburgh. Okay? In the South, if we're put together with whites in desegregated schools, our children are going to get a lesser education than the education they could get in an all-black school where we 100% control the curriculum." Right? And that put Mr. Bell on a thought process. And after he left the NAACP and became an academic, he began to wonder if the work he was doing with the NAACP, the work with Thurgood Marshall, was actually making it better for African Americans, okay, as they moved through the civil rights movement. He began to wonder, is the problem not that African Americans are being discriminated against by individuals, the bad seed, the racist school board, the racist police officer? Certainly that was happening, but he began to see that maybe the problem is much deeper than that. Maybe racism isn't just individual actions, but racism is embedded in all the social, political, and economic institutions within the United States. That became the seeds of critical race theory. So if you could click the button and move to the next slide. So here are 5 basic tenets of critical race theory. Okay? And I received these from Kiara Bridges, who is a law professor at UC Berkeley. My niece just graduated from UC Berkeley 2 years ago, and I asked her, I said, did you have a class from Ms. Bridges? And she said, "Yes, I did. She was fantastic." So I said, well, okay, well, she gets a picture on the slide. So a couple things I just wanted to say about these. You can read each one of those, but a couple things just to highlight these, and I'll go through them one in an order. Okay? First off, fundamental tenet of critical race theory. Race is not biological. Okay? We know from the Human Genome Project that there's no evidence that race appears in our biology. Race is a social construct. Okay? How we consider people, what race people are, is not within our genes. It's within our minds and how we consider them. So that's a basic tenet of critical race theory. Secondly, race is a regular feature of society embedded within systems and institutions. Okay? I pulled up, there are thousands of these I can give you. Okay? For example, Black elementary students in America are 3 or 4 times more likely than Caucasian students to be suspended from school for the exact same offenses. Black college graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed as white graduates, holding constant their GPA, holding constant their majors, and holding constant the schools they graduate from. This is the one that probably bothers me the most. Okay? Black juveniles are 18 times more likely in America to be tried as adults for the same crime being the same age than Caucasians. Okay? 18 times. That's not just bad seeds. Okay? The third point up here, okay, an individualism versus systematic explanations. An individual explanation of racism is there are individuals that are racist within society. We just have to identify those individuals, correct their viewpoints, and then racism will go away. A systematic explanation of racism is embedded within our society. It's not just individuals, it's also the institutions in which we all live. Okay? And I tried to think of what's the best way to explain this, and the one that kept bumping into me, okay, is if we make a comparison to poverty, okay, and why is poverty spread in the United States? And this is something that just is a little thing that irks me. Do you guys know who Susie Orman and Dave Ramsey are? They're the people that come on TV and say, you know, if you just save your money here and do that. And generally, they're, you know, if you follow their advice, you're probably going to do well. Okay. One of the ones I remember most, and my wife and I, it became almost a meme for us. We laughed about it. As Susie Orman said, okay, if you want to increase your wealth, you need to order the cash within your wallet. So 20s go next to 20s, 10s next to 10s. I don't have anything bigger than 20s. 5s right and 1s. And my wife and I laughed because we heard that maybe 10 years ago, and we both look at each other. Still in order. We're still not rich, right? Okay. But both of those individuals, okay, it's you, right, that determines whether you're out of poverty. Okay. Whereas many scholars that study poverty is not individually determined. Okay. It's mostly societally determined. And then what I always say about that, okay, if you think poor people are poor by choice, talk to poor people. Okay. They're working as hard as everybody else, if not harder than everybody else. There's something normally that's holding them down, not their individual achievement. Okay. Number 4, and this is probably the one that's focused on most by critical race theory, okay, racism is built into our laws and policy. And it just is. And I will say, I can give many examples of this. Housing policy within the United States, okay, today, even today, a minority applying for a loan or a mortgage is much more likely to be rejected and much more likely to get a higher interest rate, okay, irrespective of their creditworthiness. Holding constant their creditworthiness, you know, their FICO score or whatever the score you get for credit. Healthcare, okay, pregnant mothers who are minorities are much less likely to be offered prenatal care in public and private hospitals than Caucasian mothers. Again, holding all other factors constant. Okay, we can just see it here locally. Okay, we have an expressway that was built right through the east side. Okay, the 33, and I know some of you are involved in trying to get that taken out. Good for you. Okay, that destroyed a vibrant community, and we just built it right down the middle. Do we still do those things today? Sure we do. Okay, we decide to situate highways, waste facilities, you name it, based on cost. Where is it cheapest to build something? Where it's cheapest to buy the land. Where is it cheapest to buy the land? Almost always in minority communities. So therefore, waste treatment facilities, disposal, things that you wouldn't want near your home are almost always built today in minority communities because it's the most cost-effective way for a city or a community to do that, but it always puts the burden upon minority communities. Lastly, if you know anybody that is African American, they know exactly what driving while black is. Okay? I can give you an example. I've asked my students before in class, and in my students at Buffalo State, in the political science department, we're almost exactly 50% minority, 50% Caucasian. Okay? I'll ask my students, how many of you have ever been stopped and questioned by the police? Raise your hand. Right? Generally, it's mostly males that raise their hand. There's a gender bias here. Okay? And just about every one of my students that's under the age of 21, yeah, there you go. Okay, raise your hand. Okay? And then I say, how many of you have been, in the last year, have been stopped more than once? All Caucasian hands go down. Every African American male hand, especially from New York City, the hand stays up. Okay? And usually I get to about 10, 12 times in the last year have you been stopped and questioned by the police. There's usually a couple African American male hands still up. And it's usually eye-opening to my white students. Okay? That's what we're talking about. Okay? So the racism is built into our laws and our policy. Okay? Not only that, okay, critical race theory argues that while we do scientific, and I'm a quantitative scientific researcher, so I love numbers, I love statistics, that's what I do, okay, but in counting, in what we count, many times there's a bias that has a racism within it. Okay? Let me give you an example. Okay? Data is almost always collected from Caucasian communities, not minority communities. Why? Because it's easier collected from Caucasian communities. We can send messages out to cell phones, okay? It's harder to go door to door within a minority community than it is within a Caucasian community. They're more likely to be Caucasian individuals home. Minority communities, people are out working, right? They're much more likely to be working. Healthcare studies are famous for this. Healthcare studies on drugs, on treatments are almost always done on Caucasians, not on minorities. So any minority or difference based on that is simply missed in the studies. Okay? That's an example of proof of this element of critical race theory. If you move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm trying to make this as brief as possible so we can get to our discussion, which is the most interesting to me. And I know I put too many words on this, okay? And I'm kind of making a boogeyman here, okay? Because that's more fun. But this is an appropriate boogeyman, okay? How did this become a thing? Like, how did critical race theory become something that we're talking about, okay? On a Tuesday evening in Buffalo, New York, okay, weeks after an election, and it's because of individuals like Christopher Rufo, okay? That's him right there, that's a picture of Christopher, okay? Christopher was a conservative reporter in Seattle, Washington, and towards the end of this last spring, towards the summer, an individual sent to him a video that he got from a Zoom meeting of diversity training within his employment. And the diversity training was kind of over the top. Okay? It was not well done. And Chris Ruffo said, you know, I can use this. This is the perfect political vehicle I can use to attack the left, to attack the liberal side, because it has everything I need. Okay? And let me just give you a quote that he gave earlier this year talking about this. He said, elites, this is in his words, elites are seeking to re-engineer the foundation of human psychology and social institutions through the new politics of race. Political correctness as a term is dead. Cancel culture is just too vacuous a term and doesn't translate well into a political program. Woke is a good term, but nobody really knows what the heck that even means. Okay? Critical race theory is the perfect villain. The phrase critical race theory connotes hostile, academic, divisive, race-obsessed, poisonous, elitist, anti-American attitudes. And he said, to conclude that interview, he said, most importantly, critical race theory is the theory the scholars took for themselves. They can't deny it, they picked it, right? He recognized that this is the cudgel we're going to use against the other side. Now that's nothing new, and I think most of you know this, okay? We can just go back in just recent history. It goes all the way back in the country's history, but we can go back in recent history. Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, using race to gin up support for conservatives. Ronald Reagan's Welfare Queens campaign. George H.W. Bush's Willie Horton ad. Even George Bush's 2004 gay marriage scare during his re-election campaign. You go, well, that's gay marriage, that doesn't have to do with race. I went back and I looked at the commercials that Bush's campaign ran during that election cycle. Every picture of gay marriage was not of two white males or two white females. It was always mixed race. One was Caucasian and the male was always an ethnic minority. Right? That's racist, right? That's just straight racist. And then, of course, we know from the 2016 election, Donald Trump sort of blew the top off of this, okay? With Mexicans are coming here, they're drug dealers, criminals, and rapists. That's from his announcement. And then the constant repeat of there are caravans of people coming through Mexico to invade America. Okay, so this is nothing new. But how does it get from a relatively obscure journalist in way far and gone parts of the United States, up in Seattle, okay, Well, somebody saw and read his article in a city journal in Seattle, and that was the producers on Fox News. And he was invited onto Fox News. He appeared on Fox News several times. Then he hit the big time. He was invited onto the Tucker Carlson show. Okay? And once he appeared on the Tucker Carlson show, who watches it? That's the President of the United States. Literally, this happened this quickly. He appeared on Tucker Carlson. The next day, he was contacted by President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. That afternoon, he flew to D.C., and within 11 days, they wrote an executive order to ban the teaching of critical race theory in all government programs that receive federal funding, which is just about everything, right? That's how fast it happened. Okay, and as Marion talked about, we have 8 states that have now passed the law against teaching critical race theory. We have another 20 that are considering it, okay, let alone hundreds of school districts across the United States that have passed curriculum limitations within their own school district, not at the state level, but within the school district level, okay, with a remarkable chilling effect that my wife, who's a middle school teacher and teaches outside the city here, I won't say what school district, but outside the city, it has come down to her, although not official, stay away from these topics. We don't want these topics brought up. We don't want the trouble. Even though nothing has been passed within her school district, and certainly nothing has been passed in New York State. Okay, and it has a remarkable chilling effect. So I just wanted to give you that brief introduction to that. Now I would like to introduce our panelists, if I could. If I could have Crystal and Philip come on up, and we'll take a seat up here so you can see us when we're talking to you. Please give a round of applause. And again, I am so privileged to have them here. Let me start with Crystal. Crystal is the Chief of Staff for our President at Buffalo State, but she's also the Chief Diversity Officer here at Buffalo State. She relieved her law degree from the University of Buffalo and has a long resume of working in diversity issues and also working within the government here, both the Mayor Byron Brown's office and also again here at Buffalo State. Philip is also, by the way, both of these are people grew up here in Buffalo on the east side. I'm a west sider, so it's east side versus west side here, but that's okay. Okay. Philip is a Buffalo City Court judge, and so experiences the effect of racism on its most personal level within the court system that we have here in Buffalo. So please join me in welcoming them here, and let's open it up to a discussion. Okay, so what I think I'll do, okay, is if anybody has a question, just raise your hand, okay, and I'll try and find you, and then if I don't see you, just do that sort of uncomfortable cough thing really loud, like, and it's in COVID time, so all of us will notice, and then I'll call on you. Do you have a question? Yes.
You have said that, the issue of stopping young black men, and I know one young man had to do, but are you implying that it is embedded in the police in general, or individual policemen and their prejudices?
That's a great question, because that gets right to critical race theory. A critical race theorist, someone like Derek Bell, I'm giving short shift to all the other scholars that write within critical race theory, would say it's not just the individual policeman, okay? It's that within the system, okay, it's what you're looking at and what you're looking for has a racist bent to it. So, okay, like I used to be a law enforcement officer, okay, and while I did immigration law, if I saw someone that came into the United States and they had a Nigerian passport, I would immediately be looking for heroin, right? Because Nigerians are known to transport heroin, right? Irrespective of the person in front of me, right? That's a form of racism, right? I'm using a race, or I'm using, in that case, a nationality, to make a prejudgment about what actions I should take, okay? So a critical race theorist would say, it's not just a racist cop. It's not just a racist sheriff. Okay? It's the idea that the training, the structure, what is encouraged, how the whole system, okay, has a racist influence upon it.
And if I can add to that.
Can you get
Yes,
the
sir.
mic? Thank you.
And if I can add to that, in my earlier career as a prosecutor, I was designated a special assistant to the U.S. Attorney's Office, although I was employed by the Niagara District Attorney's Office. And there was grant funding for a program that was named Project Exile. And those monies were used in designating a prosecutor to partner with the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution of a certain area. And my designation as a SASA, a Special Assistant U.S. Attorney, involved investigation and prosecution of drugs and firearms. And the basis was, the idea was, where there's drugs, there's guns. And the prosecution would lead to, hopefully, a conviction where the mandatory minimum time sentence to an individual, whether it's his first time or not, or her first time or not, is 10 years. Mandatory minimum of 10 years straight out the gate. These investigations were targeted for certain areas. Of course, this was throughout the Western District of New York. My area was Niagara County, but I can assure you, if we were to say that this was Buffalo, we weren't going over, say, to LeBron, and deciding to start an investigation over there. We would go to 7th Street, or 10th Street, or Wohlers, or Box, Wyoming. All these areas that we would understand are populated by minority residents. In many instances, minority residents who were renters. Implicitly in the program was a racist base of not only target towards individuals in these depressed environments, but also the removal for lengthy time and basically, I'm sorry, I'm not talking loud enough, I'm sorry. I have a very soft voice sometimes. But so that type of system is one of many, that type of program is one of many programs that are purposed for that exclusively, the prosecution of people of color, and then their removal for some time. And you know, that's just a small example. It's not bad officers. It's a system where officers coming into become a part of and become, quite frankly, participants, and in many instances become complicit to the production of these types of programs.
I just have a question about how the duration of extraction from society is determined. I mean, who comes up with 10 years as opposed to 5 years? And who decides whether perhaps some rehabilitation may or may not change some of the situation? Because, I mean, it's a pretty complex issue, obviously.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to know who decides the amount of time a person should be extracted from society as punishment, and who investigates the possibility of rehabilitation and the underlying problems that may cause all of this.
Codified in law. On the federal level, there is a sentencing guideline, and they were suggestive to the federal judges and magistrates, but most times followed. So when I speak of a mandated or a mandatory time, that's something that's codified, that frankly gave no discretion to a judge. If this judge, or if this individual was convicted pursuant to, I think it's 924C of the U.S. Code, It resulted in the beginning time frame or sentencing time frame of a minimum of 15 years, of 10 years. In addition to that, there's also this has been removed, but there was also stacking, meaning that you can be convicted of that particular offense if there's a conspiracy charged with it, if there is a separate offense of a certain or different type of drug. Individually, those particular statutes or those particular offenses carry their own time. So you can actually add the time on top of it. I had a client who was considered to be the kingpin. He was mid-level, but he was the type of individual who basically wouldn't become an informant. So they decided, well, we're going to prosecute you as though you were the kingpin. When I first started in my representation of that young man who had never been arrested before, the starting time he was looking at was 90 years. 90 years of a search warrant of his home where guns and drugs were found in the basement. And it was an investigation over a certain time. And so it really becomes, glaringly clear that the idea of rehabilitation is sort of fairy tale. It's purpose for the removal and the housing. I know you've heard it in past times and probably present times that is the new plantation. It's the new slavery, if you will.
Thank you.
So I would just actually return that question too, to add, because the judge will give you a very legal, but who's codifying these laws? Who are the people that are, and this is a very important concept, who are the people that are in power that are able to make these decisions? Who are the people that are elected to make these decisions? And what we do know is that historically, there have been strides that have been made in the past 50 years, but historically, it is usually people who are not minorities, who are in these positions of power to be able to make decisions based upon who they see as able to be rehabilitated, who they see as having value. And there's a larger type of thing which sort of gives the example of how these things are embedded into the system, because if you're removing people from their families, if you're removing people from their communities for 10 years, it's not just impacting them, it's also impacting their children. And then what is that child then absent of as they're growing up without a parent? And of course, it's easy to say, well, the parent should have thought about that before they committed a certain crime. But this is one of those examples on how these decisions, people who have power, who make decisions, impact, for generations in some cases, people of minority or underrepresented communities.
Yeah, I had a question just about the entrenchment into the legal system and combating that because, last year, or earlier this year, pardon me, when George Floyd's killer, when the verdict came down, and, a lot of things would say his name, and as I'm watching, the aftermath, people talking about it, for me, and I'm not saying I know all about everything, I'm still waiting to hear the name Oscar Grant again, because I think he's just somebody that's just been very overgone, but again, it was something that was videotaped, captured not on one cell phone, but like hundreds of cell phones, but yet still, we have another little girl that grew up without her dad. It's still, getting punched through. And the one good thing that I thought about George Floyd's killer going to trial is there was much more repeating of when there have been those that have been killed either by police or by others, and it's not just that one. There wasn't that one girl making a videotape. There's many other things caught on video, including Oscar Grant. Like I said, his was caught it had to be about 100 times, and still his killers are out. But where is it so entrenched now that we literally have it on video? You can see it with your own eyes. It's all there, and they're still getting it. This is where I don't know, it's just one of the things that I have trouble fathoming, it's like, if you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing, and it's right in front of you, and now, and in some sense, it almost makes you feel like a little hopeless, like, you think that you've been making strides, that there have been strides made, and there isn't, and like I said, I'm still like going like, really, is anyone gonna reopen Oscar? Or, not just him too, but just many, many others, but I think it's, when it comes to him, it's the video that I saw of what happened, like, still gives me nightmares, but.
Peter?
I think what becomes really important,
Let me just run it up and I'll come back to you.
what becomes important is starting at the basic. Starting at a basic premise of understanding why it's important to say the name. It's important to say the name because, in all candor, I started out as chattel. And it's important to continue to dehumanize because then it doesn't allow you to see yourself in me. It doesn't allow, it gives you a protection, whether it be from the guilt that comes with it, because that's really what's at issue. We're at a point societally that there's just simple apathy, there's just basic apathy for even struggling to make the acknowledgement. We're all exhausted, and I'm going to say it's not just our brothers and sisters of Anglo-Saxons. I'm saying that we also are exhausted because it's really weighty to deal with broaching a conversation where we feel hopelessness, in that this is a system that is embedded in the DNA of the American experience. And I'd like to sometimes take the exercise of attempting to look through the lens that you have and putting them on and appreciating that if I'm in a position of privilege, it's very difficult for me to be willing to release privilege or to even suggest that that privilege is at the expense of someone else. It's a very difficult conversation to have. And because of that very difficult conversation, those who were the architects of the system and the participants, their children's children, who are participants in the enjoyment of the privilege, there's this willing to die for, actually, this desire to hold on to what's currently in place for their children. So there's hopelessness over here, and there's the threat of loss over there, and this, what do they call it, the interesting convergence? I can't recall what that concept was, but you have this intersection of these two polarized positions that in no way are incentivized really towards an expectation of change, because there's no desire of it by one, and there's the hopelessness of the other side as to the possibility of it.
I guess I would add that that's a part of the social construct. There has to be, in order for there to be race, there has to be a good and a bad, there has to be a superior and an inferior, and the power is held based on the superiority and the inferiority. So why would there be any incentive, to release that? In one of the things I think Philip was getting at in terms of saying the names, it is important to talk about people that this is happening to, Because as long as there is a lens where I can look, or someone can look at someone else, another human being, as less than them, then it's easy to criminalize being the victim. And that's a problem. And again, it goes to power. Who is making the decisions to indict? Who is looking at the videotapes and being able to say that this person should be brought to justice? Oftentimes, they're not equally represented, or underrepresented people are not heard in those situations. And here's the thing, it's not always an intentional thing. It's not about intention, it's about impact. As an individual, you could say that I am not a racist. As an individual, you can say that I don't believe certain things. But because that these ideologies of superiority, inferiority, good and bad have been embedded into our systems, into our policies, into our procedures, it's almost automatic. But I don't think that that's an excuse. I think that we have to address it looking at race, beginning to look at race as a social construct that those people in power. And oftentimes I have a close friend of mine, believe it or not, and she is against critical race theory. And I ask her, and she's white, and I say, well, explain your disproportionate, how much power you have, how much money, how much education you have. I'm 4 generations away from someone that was owned as property. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. She is 5 generations of a college graduate. I mean, explain that to me. And her explanation is that it's based on me personally and her families personally. Her people in her families personally. We have to be able to look at that and be honest and about that.
Share with them the personal circumstance. We're in the process of buying a home. Share with them what we just experienced.
Well, I'm an attorney and my husband is a judge, and we have okay salaries, right? And we went to apply for a mortgage that I'm sure we could qualify for, and the gentleman said that we did not qualify for it because of some student loan payment or not payment from years ago, 8 years ago on Philip's credit, and then totally dismissed us. When I called him back and I said, well, can you tell us, I'm not finding it, but can you tell us what it is we need to do to cure this? He never answered us back. We were thinking, I'm like, oh my gosh, how are we gonna solve this? We went to another mortgage person, they were like, heck yeah, you can get that house. You can get 2 houses if you want to, right? I thought it was something wrong with us. Again, this is something first generation wise. It's not like either one of us, our families have experience with buying properties and inheriting properties from 5 generations ago, right? And so Phil got so upset because he sent us what kind of card was it?
I'm in his marketing.
What holiday was it?
I think it was.
I think it was 4th of July, which made it even worse. So, and he's like, happy 4th of July. And Phil loses his mind. And he, answers back with, as you can see, he's verbose. So he answers back in terms of how we're buying the house. In fact, we're able to get a mortgage. That wasn't a problem. And you never thought back to tell us how we could fix what you said was a problem, but the next mortgage company didn't say it was a problem. I mean, Phil gave him, if he printed it out, probably was a 7-page email. But, he was extremely dismissive. Here you have 2 people of color. It didn't matter what our positions were. It doesn't matter what our salary was. He was dismissive, and he said you weren't going to be able to get a mortgage.
And here's the other thing that should be important in noting that the basis was that there was some negative marking in my credit relating to past due student loans. I would humbly suggest that even being in a circumstance where I had to pay for my education, thousands of dollars, over $100,000, is a way in which I was saddled and from being able to have credit value in order to have the American dream. So there were levels to this, and I think that it requires us to critically consider how these things are so embedded in the institutions and systems, you know, for specific or against specific populations, primarily people of color.
But there's another interesting part, and I know because I'm going to send Dr. Yakabuchi right to you. But there's another interesting part of critical race theory that Dr. Yakabuchi didn't put up there, but it's also internalized racism, right? Because neither one of us have, like I said, generational experiences of people who have purchased property and people who have purchased homes, right? We felt almost defeated, knowing our educational background, knowing our financial background, knowing that it couldn't possibly be because of one past due payment 8 years ago. We internalized that, right? And almost felt defeated. And like we weren't gonna buy a house. Yeah, and it's conditioning, and that is also a part of critical race theory. The idea that this power construct, this racial construct, that not only do people in power inflict it upon us, that we inflict it upon ourselves because that's what we've been taught by people who are in power. And when you teach that generationally, I don't know, has anybody ever heard the white man's ice is always colder? No, you've never heard, okay, my grandmother's from Alabama. So my grandmother came here to Buffalo in 1956 from Alabama. So my grandmother's stories are informed very much by her experiences having grown up in Alabama. And my grandmother would say to me growing up, among other crazy things she would say, but she would say, well, you know the white man's ice is always colder. And I literally would be 7 years old like, ice is cold. What difference does it make? But what it is that in terms of our community, if a white person said it, it must be right. Right? If it's a lawyer, if you have two lawyers, and we've both experienced this, where we will tell a client of the same race the law as it is written, but they won't accept it from us, and they will go pay someone who's not their race to go tell them the same thing, because the white man's ice is always colder. So we also have been conditioned to believe the things that those in power have said about our inferiority. And that creates another barrier that generationally keeps us behind. So there's a young lady in the back with the wonderful bob haircut who is dying to ask a question. Yes, love it.
Let me just say, related to that, as a faculty member at a university, especially a university like Buff State that has many first-time college students, the embedded racism, the embedded inferiority that I run into with my students is maddening. It's maddening. I will have brilliant students, intellectually brilliant students, and I will suggest to them a professional career, and they just look at me and say, I can't do that. There's no way I can do that. And they will have Caucasian classmates that I wouldn't trust to take my garbage out that are like, yeah, I'm gonna do that. No, you shouldn't do that. Like, no, right? And that happens all the time. Who am I giving this to? There you go.
I have two questions. Well, and I'm not sure how, for the critical race theory, are we also pulling in past, like the Chinese, they can't talk about that anymore. They can't talk about Latinos coming across the border anymore. And what do we do with 28 states that are saying we can't talk about anything that might hurt somebody's feelings along the way? I don't, where do we go? And to stop 52 or 50 states from passing things that we're just gonna now, sounds like sweep it under the rug kind of thing, right? Go ahead.
I'll answer that quickly, and then I'll bring the microphone. For me, and part of this is for my recent research I've been doing on conflict, and it's empathy. Everything comes down to empathy. Can you put yourself, as Philip said, in the position of the other and understand the position of that individual, truly understand the position of that individual? That, to me, is the first step. Now, that's a first step in many steps in the process to be able to work our way out of this. And part of it is also just opening eyes and accepting that this is true and that it could happen in society and is happening in society.
So Peter has become a fast friend, and I don't want him to not be a friend, but there's also a tenet in critical race theory that says that there is an empathetic fallacy. That it is impossible, virtually impossible for you to put yourselves in my shoes, having grown up on the east side of Buffalo, dealing with issues of addiction and mental health as a young black child. You can listen to me and you may feel sympathy, but that because of your experiences of power and privilege, it's virtually impossible for you to really understand what I went through growing up. It's not to say that you can't be sympathetic, but that there's a fallacy in terms of empathy because you really never understood. If I asked you in this room, how many of you understand or understood or grew up and you experienced that you either had to have gas, heat, or electricity, but you never had both? Raise your hand. If I would ask you to raise your hand and you were asked, how many of you lost your mother and you were bounced between grandmother and aunt for threat of going to foster care because of addiction? Raise your hand. These are things that you, I'm sure, feel sympathy for me because I just shared this with you, but you really wouldn't be able to be empathetic towards feeling it because you've never experienced anything close to it. However, it's being able to recognize, because of my racial background, because of generational policies and procedures over hundreds of years, that is one of the reasons why I experienced that as a youth growing up. Of course, there's a such thing as choice, right? But as a child growing up, what choice do I have that my mother decided to be an addict? What choice do I have that the bills couldn't get paid and it was either electricity or heat? What choice did I have to go downstairs in a basement in a double to steal hot water from the person who lived upstairs because we didn't have any, right? So there's no choice, but those things are generational. And then there was another question where you were talking about, I didn't quite understand where you were saying, talking about Chinese and Latinos coming over.
We've discriminated against lots of ethnic groups.
Right.
And would critical race theory then, these 28 states aren't allowed, you can't talk about any of this for any group.
One of the interesting parts of the background between the people who are critics of talking about critical race theory is the denial of facts. And that's what's disturbing to me, right? I can't talk about slavery, but we know that slavery happened and it was a fact. And I don't think we need to be rocket scientists to say that if you enslave a group of people based upon their race for over 400 years, that there really is no such thing as a level playing field just because you simply release them, right? They've already been set back 400 years. They've already been enslaved based upon the color of their skin in order to advance your agenda, your financial agenda and social agenda. So I don't quite understand why they don't want to talk about historical factualities like slavery, why they don't want to talk about Jim Crow, why they don't want to talk about these different things that we know that happen. What I also don't understand is why most critics often say that critical race theory goes more towards storytelling than it does fact. Well, to say that we have a level playing field in the United States of America, even in 2021, seems like a fairy tale to me. It's not a level playing field at all. And I could go on for days about that, but it seems to be the critics of critical race theory are the ones, in fact, who are perpetuating a fairy tale. Now, is there something to be said about a certain set of meritocracy, earning certain things, grades? Of course. But we have to be able to give people support, and it's not just African Americans, it's all different types of race, but also one of the things about critical race theory, it's interesting to me, is it addresses a lot of intersectionality. You should be at home when we discuss the difference between what Philip has experienced as a black male, and I'm telling him, well, heck, you're still a male, I'm a woman. So I now have to look at my intersectionality as a black woman and how I'm experiencing racism and genderism in a different way that sometimes he can't even understand.
A two-faced question. One is I certainly understand or at least I'm beginning to understand Derek Bell's general philosophy of critical race theory. But could you explain to me, so I can go home to explain to my neighbors, what is it about critical race theory that people are so afraid of coming into our schools? Like, what's going to be taught that somebody mentioned that they've already gotten some notices to stay away from those topics? What are those topics? That's number one. Number two, your husband mentioned dropping the privilege, releasing the privilege. Is there possibly any mechanism that could become a reality, that somebody could release that privilege? Because it seems to me that could be a step forward, but I can't imagine what that could be.
So I'll address the first part, and Phil can look at the second part. There are a lot of things that opponents of the critical race theory don't like. They, as I just said, they don't want to address facts, right? And the best way to explain it is the grandfathers that kept Ruby Bridges from going to school don't want their grandchildren to know that they did that. And that's just one example. But another thing, the executive order that Peter mentioned, as a chief diversity officer, I was not allowed to give any type of diversity training for fear that Buffalo State would lose its federal funding. And it was being actually exercised. There was a whole local person who was assigned to take those type of complaints, and it was a very real threat. One of a couple of catchwords that they definitely didn't like was the idea of white supremacy. So the idea that there is no such thing as white supremacy. There's no idea of privilege. We shouldn't say those things. And so to teach younger white people, and it has, they'll say it's because we don't want to teach younger minorities that there were these things because it's not helping them. I think it's actually a guilt thing. We don't want to teach younger people who are not underrepresented that there were actually these decisions and actually these policies being made based on race. And it's not to say that younger people, you know, I said earlier I'm 4 generations away from being a slave. I'm not looking for anyone who's 4 generations from being a slave owner to give me anything. I just want you to recognize that your great-great-grandfather owned my great-great-grandfather. And to recognize the impact that that has had on my family and the impact that that's had on policies. That's all, so that we can then begin to accept the mistakes that as a country we've made and then correct them. Until there's a reckoning, until there's a recognition of the mistakes, we really can't move forward and change anything. You can't, you know, I have this joke when little kids, you ever notice that little kids will cover up their eyes and it's like if they can't see what's coming for them, it's not there? We're not going to be able to solve the issues of racism with pretending that it never happened. We're not going to be able to address them. We have to be able to recognize what we did wrong so that we're not repeating it. We have to be able to see that these policies, these ideas have been absorbed into our laws, and that even the race-neutral laws may not intend to impact us differently, but they do have disparate impacts on our community. And so we need to look at that to see through a lens of equity. Has anybody ever seen the diagram, the equity diagram, where the goal is to look over the fence, and you've got a short person, a medium person, and a tall person, right? So people who are usually opponents of critical race theory would say that it's perfectly okay if you have 3 boxes that you give each one of those people a box, because that's equality, right? But the tall person, if the goal is to look over the fence, the tall person didn't need a box, right? The middle person, he needed 1 box, but the short person needed 2 boxes. If that's what we're looking at, and critical race theory tends to look more at the outcome than it does anything else. What is the goal or what is the outcome that we're looking for? We're looking for, as those of us from underrepresented minority groups are looking for, to be able to be contributing citizens without the barriers that are created or that have been created generationally that keep us from being able just to be in the race with you. That's it. You know, imagine running around a track and you have no hurdles, and at every other step, I've got a hurdle. And we need to be able to address that. And I'll let Philip answer the second part of the question.
I was so enthralled with your answer, I can't recall the question in a second. releasing privilege. It's still mind-boggling to me that I have friends or acquaintances who have only in recent time recognized that they in fact have privilege. And it's because it's so natural to their life, to their existence, that it's sufficient enough to cause, or at least it caused a friend to experience a certain depression because he realized his friend, or acquaintance, but his friend had all of these structured, cemented hurdles that were intentional. I heard that they're sometimes not intentional. The system itself is intentional. And they've been in place. Whereas his vision, his view, the landscape is clear. And he could not perceive or even imagine looking at that same landscape through my lens. It was shocking. It was something that he more or less, and I'm only repeating what he said, but it was something that he doesn't know how not to experience the privilege he has. He didn't ask for it, but it's something that he was in fact born into. It's part of his identity, which is to say the lack of privilege is a part of my identity. How do you change that? I'm embarrassed to say, my undergraduate study was philosophy. And I dealt with critical theory as a philosophy major, critical theory of family, critical theory. And I always had difficulty with critical thought. It's very difficult. The work is so hard. And I've always felt that it required all of the players, of participants at the table to agree upon a certain number of premises, to even begin to ask the right questions. Because I've always felt that critical theory is just basically a diagnosis, or an effort, or an attempt to diagnose. I'm sure I'll get beat up by the doctor here when I feel that critical theory itself does not solve problems. It only does the hard work of making the necessary acknowledgments. And then you're dealing with those at the table who either don't want to acknowledge it or justify, pacify, or in some way avoid doing the hard work of acknowledging. And so it's, I guess I'm sort of a pessimist, naturally, but I know that my journey here, as I sit here as an African American male, raising an African American male, the son of an African American male and a pastor's kid, and having many times been stopped because I was black, and many times being too ignorant to realize that I'm not supposed to be somewhere where I thought I had every right to be. On one occasion, if you don't mind me just saying, I was in Canisius College, where I graduated from. My girlfriend at that time was a white woman. And we had a night course. Kids goofing off, a little smooching and everything. And public safety stopped us and said to my girlfriend, "Are you okay?" This is why it's so layered, because she actually was raised in St. Croix, where it was predominantly black folks. She was very comfortable with black folks. So she did not truly have the Americanized understanding why he would take the approach. She was offended. Why are you asking me? You know, but you have all these episodes for me that I look back and I see that I don't necessarily make effort to say, you're a racist, you're a racist, you're a racist. It's just that they're most times in a system where they're just acting out the tenets of that particular construct. They are basically the products of a system that produced them. We all are. I mean, as a black man, many times I'm turned against myself. And it's conditioning. I have to speak outside of myself in terms of what I'm capable of doing. Because the first thing that comes to mind is what I'm either not able to do or I'm not allowed to do. You know, so, and this is 2020. I'm sure that my great-great-great-grandfather in, 1920, whatever, thinking the same thing, but the boundaries and the borders and the hurdles were far more present. It's dangerous now because we have the remnants, we have the residual impacts, or the implied results of codified law that maybe the racial language has been removed, but its impact is still purpose for a certain objective, which remains the same.
So he was a philosophy major. I'm social sciences, so he'll talk and talk and talk. I love listening to him. I think I don't think that you can get rid of privilege. If you and I walked in a room, it's clear that I'm a woman of color and that you're not, right? It doesn't matter how many law degrees, how many certificates I have from Ivy League institutions, it will be looked at different. However, you can use privilege to help alleviate these things, and it's called allyship. And that has been something that's been talked about lately in the past 2 years. If you see someone and you're able to use your voice of privilege, check them. If they are making comments, if they are acting in a certain way, you have privilege where you can address them and you can say to them, that's actually wrong. You shouldn't be thinking that way. You shouldn't be talking that way, or you shouldn't be acting that way towards someone. If you stand silent, you're actually not using the privilege that you have in a way that can help those of us without privilege. So I don't think you can get rid of privilege, but I think you can use your privilege in a different way than it has been used, and that's in a way to actually bring to light some of the things that have impacted communities of color.
I will just add as I'm walking for another question. And I'll put on my political science hat here. Part of politics is defining meaning. And think of how it's being used as a political weapon. Is America a finished product? And critics of critical race theory would say yes. I mean, think of what we were taught when we were little kids. Okay, we had the Declaration of Independence, and then we had the Constitution. But we made a big mistake. We left slavery in there. Well, we fixed that. We fixed that with the Civil War. But then there was Jim Crow. Well, then we fixed it with the Civil Rights Movement. So we're good. We're done. Okay? A critical race theory would say, obviously not. Okay? But by saying obviously not, you're telling individuals that have lived their whole life living the Schoolhouse Rock, definition of America. Okay? That we are the greatest place on earth, that we are the greatest democracy in the world, that we provide opportunity and success for everyone, irrespective of their race, their gender, any other demographic you can think of. To challenge that is challenging what you are as an individual. That's really, really hard to accept that and work your way through that.
I just want to bring in a slightly different angle. I'm originally from Germany. Germany had a horrendous history of racism in the 20th century. And America and the Allies have valiantly fought and were victorious to get rid of the dictator and the government in place. That doesn't erase the fact that horrendous sins were committed, that millions of people died. However, the government of Germany has acknowledged, and that's the word that you used, they have acknowledged history. The government of Germany has made valiant efforts to put laws in place. I mean, some people say to make it against the law to speak against the Holocaust or to deny the Holocaust is against the law. Well, a friend of mine who's a rabbi says, hey, they'll just go underground. And they do. And there are underground people in Germany, and there is the alternative for Germany, yes, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a new political party, which is now part of the parliament. They have a voice, and they are part of the German population, and I don't like it. But there's a lot of stuff we don't like in society. We have to acknowledge history in order to be able to move forward. Look back and learn from history so that we can be better in the future, that we can make a change, that I, as a white person, can say, don't say that, don't do that to my friend. You are wrong. And they may hate me for it, but if I can use my so-called privilege in that way, fine. I'll be happy to do it. I'm just saying, why can't America acknowledge the fact that the American Indians were driven off their land? That in the Declaration of Independence there is still that sentence which says that the natives are a lesser person. And it's still there. That sentence is still part of the Declaration of Independence. And that hasn't been taken away. Where are you?
Thank you very much. I know we're running late on time. Yes, and so I might cut it off with one more question. Oh goodness, now I have to make choices. Here we go. Okay, hold on, I'm gonna come this way.
As an African American, and I'm sitting here listening to both of you, you brought up a lot of very interesting points and factors, which, I don't know, you can't really tell my age, but I've lived through a lot of what you're talking about. The Martin Luther King era and all the way up through now. And when we're talking about the critical race theory, the first thing that I'm thinking of is they're coming out with this now. What are they going to do? Just throw away all of the history, all of the African American history, all of the Native American history, all of our books, all of the things that have been written, the music, I mean, what is it that they want to do?
But they haven't been written, that's the problem.
Okay.
It's still his story. The problem is that right now today, there was a huge, even locally here, the idea of changing Christopher Columbus's, the Christopher Columbus Day, the holiday. Think about how that disrupts what we've learned as children.
You're saying important things.
I'm sorry, I get so passionate. Think about how disruptive it has been in terms of monuments coming down from things we have learned in our collective curriculum that did not in any way include the full story. I didn't even learn of the Harlem Renaissance until I went to college and took a black course. I didn't know about an Allen Locke.
Who's writing the books?
So I went through public education, and I'll tell you, I'm very proud to have had public education. A small commercial, but I realized that there was so much that I did not receive that allowed me to feel as if I'm a part of this country, other than being the source of capitalism through slavery. And even the idea that we would need to have a February to talk about this is to suggest to Americans. So this is where we are. How disruptive it would in fact be if we in fact had that education starting now, saying, hey, because there's an Amistad curriculum that's been undertaken, and I don't even hear anything else, anything about it. But it goes back to identification of the tribes that came over. It goes all the way back to humanizing those individuals who were in fact slaves coming in America. How disruptive that would be to the system.
When you're talking about Columbus, I remember I was a child, and they mentioned in my kindergarten, whatever, about Columbus. And I said to my little mind, weren't there people there before Columbus?
How do you discover something and there's people there? And let's not talk about the fact that he said they were Indians because he thought he was in India.
And so,
Means there's that.
of course, I learned there were
Right,
people,
right,
thriving communities
right.
that were there probably long before the Egyptians and what have you.
Right.
I'm still learning.
And I know we're cutting short on time, but imagine the impact it has on a young black person that the beginning of your being as an American is in slavery. What does that say? It almost actually erases or dehumanizes you any type of existence prior to coming over here in slavery. That's where it begins, in slavery. What does that say about who you can be and who you can grow to be and limitations and creating limitations?
So I think I'm gonna have to cut off questions on all of you because we're well over time.
It's getting so a positive comment.
You want to end on a positive comment? My dinner was delicious. But I would like to thank all of you for coming here, especially my fellow panelists, Philip and Crystal, and their comments, but all of you for your questions and your comments and being willing to be engaged.
Derek Bell, of critical race theory. At the end of that article, September 20th, New York, just tell us.
That's